Hello beauty, in this video, I'll show you a step-by-step detailed process of sewing a vest with an open back. Let's start with the front pieces of the vest. At the very beginning, I always transfer important lines from the pattern onto the fabric. I've transferred the lapel line and the center front line where we'll align the two front pieces of the vest, as well as the placement of buttons and buttonholes. So, in front of me are two central front panels and two side front panel pieces. I join the side panel with the front panel. I start aligning the pieces from the bottom, moving upwards, and pin them together. Note that when you turn the joined pieces so that the central panel of the vest is on top, you will see a 1 cm seam allowance of the side panel peeking out at the bottom. This is how it should be. When we sew the pieces together, the bottom line will be even. So, when aligning the central panel with the side panel, make sure the bottom line is even. So, at the beginning and end of the stitch, I make a backstitch. Press the seam towards the center of the front piece, but first, I simply press the seam. I iron the bust area on a special ironing ham to shape the bust nicely, and now I press it towards the center front. If you have any unevenness along the armhole line, like I do, be sure to trim the excess to even out the armhole line. I have already finished the raw edges with an overlock. Now we will join the facing pieces for the front. First, I join the facing pieces for the bottom edge of the front pieces of the vest. Pay attention to the markings on the pattern to align the pieces correctly. Press the seams open. Trim any excess seam allowances that stick out. All facing pieces need to be interfaced with interfacing. I apply the interfacing to the wrong side of the pieces. I take the main facing pieces for the front. I have also transferred the lapel line from the pattern onto the fabric. I interfaced the wrong side of the pieces and finished the raw edge with an overlock. Now, join the main facing pieces with the facings for the bottom edge. Pin them together with the right sides facing. Press the seam open. Joining the facings with the front pieces, I place the facing right side down on the front piece of the vest, so the right sides of the pieces are together. I also prepare the facings for the armhole. I interface them on the wrong side and finish the raw edges with an overlock. Note that the part where the collar will be attached is not sewn. The seam will start from this marking and go down to the bottom. This marking is on the pattern, along with other necessary markings, so make sure to transfer all markings from the pattern to the fabric. So, I have sewn the front pieces and facings together. Before turning the pieces right side out, the corners need to be trimmed. Now, look where the seam started and where there is a marking. Make a cut up to the seam line, being careful not to cut the seam itself. Turn the pieces right side out, and the seam allowances for attaching the collar are now turned out as well. Make a cut exactly along the line that I marked earlier when I transferred the marking from the pattern to the fabric. Collar. Since I had limited fabric, I cut the back pieces of the vest not on the fold. Therefore, my collar has a seam in the middle. The main thing to do is to interface the upper collar on the wrong side with interfacing. First, I press the seam open. I trim the seam allowances, leaving a 0.4 mm allowance to avoid bulk when joining the upper and lower collars. When cutting interfacing for the collar, ensure minimal stretch is horizontal. So, we have an upper and a lower collar. Pin them together with right sides facing, pin along the top edge. The upper collar is slightly longer than the lower collar. This is intentional. I pin the ends of the collars, and you can see the corner of the collar lifts up. It's important to distribute the upper collar on the lower collar along the side edge so that this corner lifts up. That's why the upper collar is longer than the lower collar. When you turn the collar right side out after sewing, you'll see the corners of the collar nicely directed inward, not sticking up. Measure 1 centimeter from the bottom edge on both sides of the collar. Sew the seam from this mark to the same mark on the other side. Trim the corners and leave a 0.5 cm seam allowance along the top edge. Turn the collar right side out. Hand stitch the top line of the collar. Attaching the collar, we can proceed to attaching the collar to the front pieces of the vest. I take the lower collar and move the facing piece down so it doesn't interfere. Join the lower collar with the central panel of the vest. The seam allowance on the side edge of the collar is turned inside the collar, and for convenience, I secure it with a pin. Pin the lower collar to the central panel of the vest. Here's how it looks when the pieces are turned to the wrong side. The upper part of the facing is directed down and doesn't interfere. On the other side, also move the upper part of the facing down. Take the lower collar. Secure the seam allowance on the side edge of the collar inside with a pin. And pin the lower collar to the central panel of the vest. I recommend basting the pieces by hand before machine stitching, especially if you're a beginner. This saves time for any level of sewer, as unpicking a poorly sewn collar takes more time. It's better to baste by hand once and then confidently machine stitch. What do you think about this? I move the upper collar to the side and secure it with a pin. I also move the upper part of the facing to the side on the wrong side of the vest and also fix it with a pin, so that these parts do not get into the seam connecting the lower collar with the front central panel. Now, join the upper collar with the upper part of the front facing. Place the upper part of the facing on the upper collar, right sides together. On the other side, also join the upper collar with the facing. So, when sewing the upper and lower collars, leave a 1 cm seam allowance along the armhole edge of the facing and the armhole line on the central front panel side. I have sewn the facings for the armholes. Pin the armhole facing and direct the seam allowance on the armhole seam inside. direct the seam allowances inside the collar. The seam allowance on the armhole seam on the facing should also be directed inside. The seam allowances along the neckline on the back collar side are also directed inside the collar. To make it clearer what I'm doing and what needs to be done, I first secured all the seam allowances with hand stitches. Using hand stitches, I secure the seam allowances directed towards the inside of the collar. I direct the seam allowance on the facing along the armhole line inward and fix it with hand stitches. I also direct the seam allowance along the armhole line on the central front panel inward and secure it with hand stitches. Using hand stitches, I fix the seam allowances directed towards the inside of the lower collar. Now that the seam allowances are secured inside the collar, I join the top and bottom collar along this line. I move on to combining the line of the armhole of the facing and the central front panel. Join the upper and lower collars along the bottom edge. I direct the 1 cm seam allowance inside the top collar and secure it with hand stitches. On the lower collar I also direct an allowance of 1 cm inside the collar and secure it with hand stitches. Now that the seam allowances are directed towards the inside of the collar and secured, I connect the top and bottom collar along the hemline using hand stitches. From the line where the lapel will fold, baste by hand from the main front piece side so that when we turn the lapel, the seam won't be visible. I will baste the rest of the vest by hand from the wrong side. This also applies to the top stitching we will do on the sewing machine. Back. I cut the back pieces of the vest with a seam allowance at the center because I had limited fabric. However, the pattern indicates that the back pieces should be cut on the fold. First, I sew the back pieces together at the center and press the seams open. Interface the facings for the upper and lower edges of the back with fusible interfacing on the wrong side. Finish the raw edges with an overlock. Turn the back piece right side out and place the facing on the lower edge of the back and the upper edge of the back, right sides together. Pin them together. sew. At the center seam of the back, trim the seam allowance to 0.2 centimeters to prevent bulk in this area. Joining the back with the front. For this, open the seam allowances on the side edges of the back. Open the seam allowances on the side edges of the front pieces as well. Join the back to the front at the side edges, right sides together. On the other side of the front piece, open the seam allowances along the side edge as well. Pin the back to the front. Finish the raw edges with an overlock. The side seams will be pressed open. Now, turn the facing along the lower edge of the vest inward and pin it. Turn the facing along the upper edge of the vest inward and pin it. Baste by hand from the wrong side of the vest. Before top stitching, I recommend pressing the vest. Top stitch along the front side of the vest first at 0.5 centimeters from the edge. Then a second top stitch at 0.1 centimeters from the edge. The top stitch on the collar should be done on the upper collar. Start and end the stitch at the mark indicating the end of the lapel fold line. I also finished the top stitch where I started, where the mark of the lapel fold line is. Then a second top stitch at 0.1 centimeters from the edge. Secure the join between the upper and lower collars along the neckline with a stitch in the seam. To secure the facing and prevent it from flipping to the front side of the vest, stitch in the side seam. This stitch will not be visible from the front as it is sewn in the seam. However, it will be visible from the inside and will keep the facing in place. Let's proceed with the buttonholes. I switched the regular presser foot to the buttonhole foot. Before making buttonholes on the vest, I recommend practicing on a scrap piece of fabric and adjusting your sewing machine settings to achieve the desired stitch. all the threads on the front side of the vest, I pull to the wrong side. Then I tie the threads. Instead of cutting the threads, I hide their ends inside the vest. This way, the inside of the vest will look neat and clean. Visible cut thread ends are only acceptable in lined garments, as they will be hidden between the main fabric and the lining. What do you think about this? Cut the buttonhole openings. The wrong side of the vest looks neat, clean, and beautiful. See you in the next video tutorial. Bye.